So I watched the Mr. McMahon documentary last week. I wanted to gather some thoughts and just kind of shoot at the hip with you guys about my overall thoughts consensus with this documentary. I don't think it delivered on what I expected it to. I had other ideas and expectations of what this documentary of Mr. McMahon, Vince McMahon, was going to actually be. And after watching it and listening to podcasts and everyone's thoughts on it, I got similar takeaways like other people. Number one, there really is no difference between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon on-screen character. It's Vince turned up to 11. That's on TV. That's what it really seems like. And that's even with the comments of like Bruce Pritchard and others talking about who Vince is. The main problem I had with this documentary was it didn't go in depth into the things that I think a lot of people, a lot of wrestling fans were hoping to hear about and find out about. This felt like greatest hits in terms of WWE scandals and moments, rather than looking specifically at the human being Vince McMahon, why he is the way he is, and yes, how he built and grew WWF, WWE. Like, my main takeaway for this feels like this is not for the wrestling audience. This feels like it's for the Netflix audience. This feels like it is for people that are casually scrolling through Netflix and going, oh, I used to watch WWF as a kid. I remember Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin. You know, I want to watch this thing and see what it's about. So for a very, very casual person or somebody that has like no knowledge of wrestling, you might take away that, oh, like this was interesting. It's only 6 parts. It kind of hits all of these top flavors across the board over the decades. And you're kind of left going, oh, okay, that was interesting. But for anybody that has followed wrestling, that has followed WWE, nothing was new here. Nothing was uncovered, in my opinion, that changed my perspective, that gave me a greater understanding. In fact, I think a lot of stuff was just skimmed over, and some points seem to be incorrect. And Vince's recalling of things, like he was in there, he was sitting down, he couldn't recall a bunch of different stuff. I think at one point Paul Heyman was off camera and he was telling him how things were. So Vince is just, a lot of the time, seemed to be just playing into, well, I don't remember, or I thought it was this, or, oh, we were sued by Sable. Oh, I don't remember that. Whether that's true or not, you didn't find anything else out about him. So for example, I think one of the more interesting things that we didn't learn from the Vince documentary, the Mr. McMahon, was his childhood. It was so glossed over. And there have been things like his interview with Playboy years ago that actually gave you more information than this documentary did, where they talked about very briefly in the Netflix series about the abuse and what he dealt with as a kid, the stepfather, and then Vince McMahon Sr. coming into the picture not until he was 12. There's stuff with the mother, but like they never went into who he was as a kid. They never got any interviews with like his brother before he passed. They never got interviews with his mom at any point in the last 20 years. They never got anybody talking about, they didn't get like Linda talking about Vince, like when you met him, when he was a teenager, what was he like? What would he do? It was all just wrestling, the business. That's all we ever knew. And I highlight this because I think it would be important to know these things to give you a better understanding of maybe why Vince is a scumbag and is a creepo, like today and as an adult. I think it would have levied more to him and just understanding who he is as a human being. You know, I was going into gross details about his childhood, but it would have been good if Vince was able to give some more information, more details of what it was like. So you get things like Hulkamania, but again, it's like I've seen documentaries, there's been books on all of this, so nothing was new. They just skimmed over it and talked about how important Hulkamania was. The thing too that like highlighted for me was Vince being kind of a hypocrite with details. So like they briefly talk about the territories, and I understand, like if you went into every single thing into detail with Vince, like it would be a 15-part docu-series. So I get it. You got to find a healthy balance. But they talk about the territories and they talk about Vince rising up and, you know, his dad giving him like a small piece of a territory to try it out, and then like he was gonna buy out the rest of the company, but his dad had cancer and he was dying anyway. So like Vince kind of plays it as if he had to like grind and struggle in order to become a promoter, to run the company and all of that. Well, he really didn't. His dad was going to give it to him. He ran a part of the territory. He paid his dad in installments, and then his dad passed away shortly after that. But with the territories, Vince, and where he's kind of a hypocrite with things, Vince gobbled up main stars, main talent from all these territories across the United States, brought them into WWF. And you can say like, okay, he wanted to become bigger, larger than life, do bigger things than what was going on with wrestling at that point. He wanted to create this giant form of entertainment, and he did. So we can't deny the accomplishments and the things that Vince did. But where it seems hypocritical is where in the interview, he would get offended that Ted Turner would turn around and gobbled up stars from WCW and for like what he built in WWF. So when they would get guys like Luger and Hogan and Savage, and Vince talking like it's not fair, he shouldn't have done that, it's like you literally did the exact same thing with the territories. All these existing talents that were already built, Vince gobbled up and then used them on his program. And then he got mad that Turner did it and he played more of the victim card there. And that's what I've seen from even Vince McMahon in interviews here and there over the years. He likes to play himself as like this small time promoter, this kid who did it himself, bootstraps, you know, made success for himself. And he's going up against the evil corporations and the government and going up against Ted Turner. And it's like, Vince, you got like millions of dollars. Like where did all the money come from? One of the other big takeaways, and maybe you had this too, was Vince's like, there was a lot of quotes in here and I'm not going through them all, but like there were a lot of moments where Vince is speaking and it's all about, it's in the past. Vince's perspective seems like whatever happened yesterday was yesterday and it doesn't matter. Whatever happened 30 years ago with like Rita Chatterton or the boys or whatever the case may be, that's all back there. I don't like looking back there. That's what he said. He doesn't like to look in the past at all for things that he may have done. There's no point, you gotta move forward, pal. Like, it's all just about, like, he just does what he does in the moment, and his kind of defense here, seemingly, is just like, well, that was how it was back in the day, so that's how we did it. You got interesting comments from Tony Atlas in there, too, about how the way they would treat or mistreat women in the locker room, young men setting up the ring, like a lot of scandals, a lot of horrible behavior, and very much just dismissed as part of the times. And then that even goes into things like Attitude Era. So I like that they cover overall the broad strokes, and it gives you that little nostalgia as a wrestling fan of like, okay, I see the clips of Austin and Rock and all of this. They get into CTE and a lot of different things and the height of the Attitude Era, and then doing all the scandalous stuff, the salacious stuff with Vince, going into like his moments with Trish and Linda and that feud WrestleMania 17 against Shane. Vince makes out with everybody, the bra and panties matches, Sable, like all of the salacious stuff they talk about kind of briefly, but Vince just chalks it up to, well, that's what was going on in mainstream culture at the time, so we did that. And it's, again, it seems like it's just kind of his excuses of, this was what was happening, so we did that. Like, they would talk about how like, oh, Jerry Springer was like a mainstay. And we've heard that for years as well. Like the comparisons between Springer and WWF and Vince kind of modeling things after that in the Attitude Era. It's like, it's not, the whole world wasn't like that. There's a little subsection of people doing that. And again, sure, the ratings prove that, well, that stuff worked at the time. Another thing too is like they spent so much time, I felt, on the 80s, and I get it. It's kind of the rise of Hulkamania and WWF and, you know, WrestleMania 1 and what it really meant to then like the further success of the company. I understand it, but they glossed over Austin like a lot. Like they had one or two little interviews with Austin. He had a CTE comments, which were kind of weird, and I don't know if they were taken out of context, but they didn't really go into how, like they did with Hogan, how Austin was the biggest money-making draw of all time and what that meant. They go through a little bit of the character Mr. McMahon and how after the Montreal Screwjob, which apparently Triple H and HBK knew and Vince told them, you know, just deny it forever, and to Bret Hart's face, we get that on-screen moment of Vince coming out and saying Bret screwed Bret, which kickstarted the Mr. McMahon character. But it feels like over the years, and like we talk ruthless aggression era in there too, it felt like Vince simply utilized his platform to act out his real feelings and how he really likes to behave, specifically around women. Sable sues the company for sexual harassment, and then 4 years later, she's back on WWE TV, and they use and talk about on camera that she sued everybody. They sue the company for sexual harassment, and they use that in the storyline. And the big one too with all of the women stuff is Rita Chatterton, where Vince is sitting there and talks about how there was no rape, and even if there was, there's a statute of limitations on these things. Like right there was I was kind of done with Vince. Like I already was, but he like vaguely defends himself and then immediately said something like that where it just destroys any credibility he might have already had. Now I mentioned like Steve Austin talking about CTE, and he's like, I'm not a CTE guy. They talked about the head trauma, Chris Benoit, all of those things. WWE putting in more policies in place, which is a good thing. They did do all of that because there's so many chair shots. You got guys like Undertaker who are just like, he doesn't like that they took away chair shots to the head, but kind of denying that any of it is an impact. And Austin saying like he's not a CTE guy. I didn't quite understand that. I know a lot of people and a lot of sites and everybody is talking about why did Austin say that? Oh, he doesn't believe in CTE, talking about how like he got one concussion when he was dumped on his head when he broke his neck, and that was like the one time he got a concussion. If you're doing it right, you don't really get, head trauma, you don't really get a concussion. I just want to know like the full context of what he said. I kind of felt like it was almost cut and taken out of context a little bit. Maybe not, maybe that was just how he feels, and fine, that's how he feels. But it does kind of feel like, okay, what are you referring to exactly? Are you referring to the specific situation with Benoit, and you don't believe that CTE played a role in that? Do you not believe in CTE at all, and that it's not a real thing? So there's some context that's left out there. I thought one of the interesting things was like Shane McMahon. I thought Shane came across really well in the whole interview, all the sit downs, and it did make you understand that like, and it's odd because Vince growing up, and he even says this in the interviews, that he was basically like, he never got the approval from his father. He had the whole thing with the stepfather and all the abuse and everything going on there. Then he meets his real dad, and he's working so hard to get his own real father's approval and to notice him. And the only time his dad said he loved him was when he was dying. He said, Vince talks about how he met his real father for the first time, and he didn't get a hug, and he kind of like built it up in his head of what it was going to be like. And that he gave him like a weird handshake thing, and that was it. So then you fast forward to Shane, and Shane, they talked about him wanting to get the UFC and Vince not wanting to do that. And Shane over the years in WWE doing all of these crazy spots, moments, being on camera all the time. And Shane seemingly, it really feels like he's just trying to get like a win from his dad. He's just trying to get an attaboy. He's just trying to get a hug from his dad, that his dad never gave him any of the love and never showed anything. It's only until he had the match with Undertaker after he returned that he got a hug. And it's like Vince doing the same thing that his dad did to him. This weird dynamic with his family. You got the interviews with Stephanie talking about how there was the pregnancy storyline that they did not do because Stephanie wouldn't do it, where it was going to be Vince impregnates his daughter and they were going to roll with that. I never quite got the feeling that I understood anything new about Vince McMahon. It's also, you got to keep in mind of the timing of these interviews. This is before all the Janelle Grant stuff that came out, and they had to stop the interviews, and they even did that in the documentary towards the end, that the interviews with McMahon stopped. But how much different was it going to be had those allegations, if none of that stuff came out, if Vince still owned the company, if he didn't sell it to TKO? Because you have everybody like Stephanie and Bruce Pritchard, Jimmy Hart, and they're not talking about, like, they're all very careful because at the time Vince is still in charge of the company. So Jimmy Hart's like, I don't know what I'm allowed to say or not. Like, why would he get himself in trouble? Because at that point, people didn't really know what was going on with Vince. So that's where I say, like, I didn't learn anything new. And as a wrestling fan, I'm like, okay, you got some of like the highlight greatest hits, but there's like Dark Side of the Ring, there's books, there's tons of stuff out there that gives you way better insight than this ever did. And I was kind of hoping like you would get way more out of this from Vince himself. Again, I thought some stuff was just not correct. I think they also glossed over a ton of stuff. It didn't paint Vince as this glowing character, but when the whole kind of thesis of it is supposed to be, we're trying to figure out who is Vince McMahon, what is the separation between Mr. McMahon and Vince, and you never really get that at the end. The impression I get from Vince McMahon sitting there is the guy has no remorse. The guy is pretty much evil. He doesn't feel he's ever done anything wrong. He's always had other people to kind of take the fall for anything bad going on in the company. He chalks it up to just that it is what it is and it was in the past and things are fine. Like, the amount of time the guy has been sued for all this behavior and everything he has done is ridiculous. Saying things that are consensual, and then also, wow, there's a statute of limitations on it, pal. So even if I did do it, it's in the past. Like, that's not right. But what did you think of the documentary? What were some of the goods, and what stood out to you as like shocking or not good about Vince McMahon? But hey, on a positive note, we got lots more content on the channel. Click right here because I got more WWE stuff to talk to you about. Have a great day. See ya.